This is GZO Manga. Welcome to the studio. Today we are going to be working on how to draw poses, specifically sexy poses. Here you have 5 female figures, all very curvy, all with a lot of flow. I highly recommend reviewing before watching this video my other video on how to practice drawing different action figures, where we can establish the stick figure first. In this video, we're basically gonna go backwards. We have the pose and the finished piece, but now I want to show you the skeletal structure that's underneath these poses that leads to the finished result. Step number 1, if you know how to draw a stick figure, draw a circle for the head of our stick figure. I've curved the spine. Now I'm adding a rib cage, giving that rib cage depth. And finally the pelvis. As you can tell, I also drew a cross on the front of the head, on the circle that represents the head. That cross represents what direction your head is facing. Now that is pose number 1. I have demonstrated the skeletal structure of pose number 1 with a flowing spine and flowing body. This is pose number 2. Head first, again with this curved spine. But this pose actually employs perspective. And the rule of perspective is the closer something is to you, the larger it appears. And the farther an object is from you, the smaller it appears. So I drew the hips first and then the rib cage. And I connected both of them with that little hint of a spine. Notice again how the rib cage and the pelvis are represented by 3D objects. I'm adding shading to emphasize that this is in fact a 3D shape. So let's practice our 3D shape. Look at this cube. By adding 2 different planes and shading, I've emphasized it is a 3D shape. Same thing with this sphere. By knowing which direction the light is hitting, I can add the proper shading for direction. Let's practice pose number 3. Perspective is also employed, so I'm drawing the pelvis first. And now I'm going to add the rib cage. There we go. And finally the head that's placed behind the rib cage. Because the way the body is turned and posed, the rib cage is in front. Let's practice these 3D shapes again using perspective. Remember, the larger something is, the closer it is to the audience, the smaller it is, the farther away it is from us audiences. And I'm adding these shades to further emphasize the 3D object. Let's move on to pose number 4. Here I have that cross again to show that the direction of the head is facing downwards. The head is tilted downwards, and the spine helps that tilt. The rib cage, again, looking almost like a cube, and the pelvis, going back to that simple shapes, is in the shape of a triangle. Now I'm adding shading to emphasize the direction of light and the fact that this is a 3D object. The rib, again, is a 3D object. Think of it as a 3D model that we're building using the skeleton of the stick figure. Pose number 5. The head is facing away from us, almost in a profile view. The spine is curved. The rib cage is sat just below. There we go. And the pelvis is tilted as well. Now, that curve I've added is to demonstrate in the pelvis where the hips are aligned and where the legs are going to come out from the side of the pelvis. And I've added shading to emphasize direction. With that, let's take a step back and look at what we have so far. We have practiced now moving backwards. We're looking at the structure of the head, rib, and pelvis. How these 3 core structures are connected together by the spine. And based on how we pose, using perspective, if the pelvis is placed in front of the ribs or if the ribs are placed in front of the pelvis, these are going to manipulate and influence the direction of the pose and of the different limbs connected to the body. Alright, with that, let's review the core building blocks of our stick figure / skeleton. Circle for the head, oval for the torso, triangle for the pelvis, and with our spine, we connect the 3 core building block structures. And now we can add the joints and extend the limbs to complete our full skeleton. Everything is connected like so. Keep it simple, stupid. Let's put it into practice and finish connecting the rest of the limbs onto the torso we have already created using our basic building blocks: head, rib cage, pelvis. So here I go with the shoulders. From the shoulders we go to the elbows. From the elbows we can pose, and now I'm connecting the torso to the pelvis with a curved line to emphasize the fleshy muscle part that we're going to add later. The hips to the knees. And just like that, we have our finished skeleton ready for us to add meat on the bones, with the joints connecting each limb. Excellent. Now, these poses are very complicated. They get complicated, so feel free to pause the video or rewind whatever section you need. I'm going to go ahead with pose number 2. I've already attached the hips to the knees, making circles to emphasize the joints. Taking to look that the foot on one of the legs is actually in perspective because it's in front. Now I'm attaching the shoulder, elbow, and again I'm connecting the torso with the hips, and finally the last arm that's outstretched slightly behind. With that, I'm going to move on to pose number 3. Hips to knees, knees to triangular feet, keeping it to basic shapes. Again, remember, everything is just a basic shape. Shoulder to elbows. And you can see I'm pointing an arrow to emphasize the fact that one of the arms is hidden behind the torso. So I only had to draw one arm. Moving on to pose number 4. Shoulder down to the hand. Locate the elbow, shoulder, hand, elbow. Collarbone, and hip to knees, knees to foot. And let me connect that torso and pelvis. There we go. Pointed downwards. On to the final pose. Shoulder, hands, elbows. Connect your joints. Locate your hips and knees. And the feet, once again, triangle shape, basic triangle shape. And connect finally your torso to your hips. And just like that, we have completed the skeletons with our building blocks, and finally the skeletal structure of the additional limbs that we use to move around and pose our bodies. Finally, we are going to review adding the meat on the bones, in other words, the muscle structures of the bodies of these poses. So I'm going to outline the pose itself. And after I'm done outlining, I'm actually going to locate and distinguish the different parts of the limb and the different muscle groups that we are using. I think it's really important and good practice to be able to distinguish the different parts of the body and different shapes. The breasts are clearly very circular. You can tell now that I'm outlining the torso and outlining the thigh, we understand the thickness, the depth of this figure. I am a little bit at a loss for words, and maybe next time I can focus a little more on articulating this better. I really hope I'm saying this well enough. But with practice, here we are with pose number 2, with practice, hopefully you'll understand what it means to separate each limb and the importance of practicing the curve of the muscles. Once again, this section with the legs is in front of the torso, so the legs look bigger and the torso is somewhat hidden in the back. The arm separated from the hand, the forearm versus the shoulder, the upper arm, and the head. I'm going to move on and finish up these last 3 poses to distinguish the different muscle groups And basically, I'm breaking down once again further, the different parts of the body and how each is placed in front of the other. Let's review our 3D shapes again. On top, I am drawing a cylinder, and this should be used to represent your muscles. Notice how the curve demonstrates the direction of this 3D object. I'm going to practice with another cylinder on the side, and by adding shading, just like that, I once again give the 3D object direction and lighting. The more you practice 3D shapes like cones, cubes, pyramids, here I go again practicing a cube, the more you practice these, the more of a grasp you're going to have on the direction, shape, and thickness of your human limbs. Let's add those same curves onto the separated muscle groups. Finally, now that we've completed our poses, I'm going to separate and color code the body parts, just to emphasize and highlight to you, the viewer, how you should separate your body when you're creating your pose. Like that, we've completed our 5 basic sexy female poses working backwards. I hope now you have somewhat of a better grasp of creating your skeleton and adding the additional muscles to help with the flow and depth of your poses and your characters. I'll see you guys in the next video.